Well, welcome everybody. My name is Christine Curry, and I am the Iowa Outreach Coordinator of the Izaak Walton League's Upper Mississippi River Initiative. And I'd like to welcome everybody to our 2023 series on soil and water conservation, Thinking Like a Watershed program. The monthly presentations are jointly hosted with our Izaak Walton League colleagues of the Upper Mississippi River Initiative, and co-hosts include Panora Conservation Chapter member Chris Henning, who is on right now. She's helping, and she's already spoken to a few of you. And our Des Moines Chapter Communications Director, Bud Hartley. Bud is actually at the Des Moines Izaak Walton League, and I believe they are streaming live from there. So they have quite a few people in the audience as well. So welcome. This evening, we have a really special presentation called "We Are Not Farm Bill Flyover States," and how ag conservation strategists in Minnesota, Iowa, and beyond hope to deliver soil and climate priorities on the back of the Inflation Reduction Act. A preview of what's next with Duane Hovorka, the Agriculture Program Director of the Izaak Walton League of America, and Ben Knuth, Agriculture Policy Specialist of the National Wildlife Federation. Both of these organizations are two of the oldest conservation organizations in the country. So we are super happy and super pleased to have both of you here. They will be discussing a five-year design of the new federal farm bill. Received a reset last fall when Congress authorized the Climate Forward Inflation Reduction Act. With those separate funds and a new Congress in mind, ag conservationists in Minnesota, Iowa, and other places have met early to pool priorities and strategies. Led by the Izaak Walton League and the National Wildlife Foundation, participants sorted out results of last year's listening sessions, how best to make good on non-operating landowner demands, on the need for meat processors for an update to soil erosion formulas, for insurance incentives, for soil health practices, for doubling conservation dollar programs known to better water, soil, wildlife, and climate needs. So welcome. I'm going to go ahead and let Duane just talk a little bit about the Izaak Walton League, and then Ben, just a little background about the National Wildlife Federation. Super exciting. Thank you both for taking time to be with all of us this evening. And thank you everybody on the Zoom for participating as well.
Well, thanks, Christine, and thanks for everybody who's online. We really appreciate your time. So some of you have this memorized, I'm sure, but the Izaak Walton League was created in 1922 by 54 anglers who were mad because they were losing their fishing holes and their wetlands were being drained and dried up and the rivers were being polluted. And they said, you know, it's time to put a stop to that, to make a difference. And the organization spread around the country. And from the earliest days, we were involved in agriculture policy. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the early farm bills, but the Izaak Walton League was involved over the years in different pieces of what we call today the Farm Bill, like Old MacDonald had a farm. It's the federal farm bill. That's what we're here to talk about tonight. And so Izaak Walton League's been around about 100 years. Today, we've got about 42,000 members in about 200 chapters around different parts of the country. So, and let me turn it over to my friend Ben Knuth, friend and colleague from National Wildlife Federation, to tell us a little bit about NWF.
Yeah, thanks, Duane. And thanks to everybody for joining tonight. Appreciate the offer to present along with Duane, who I work with pretty closely on a number of different things. I don't have, I think, quite the knowledge of the history of NWF that Duane does of Izaak Walton League, but what I can tell you is that NWF is a America's largest, and we like to say we're the most trusted conservation organization in the country, representing 52 state and territorial affiliates. That number fluctuates a little bit from year to year. So if you look it up and it says 53 or 51, don't hold me to it. And we have been around since 1936. So we're a little bit younger and a little bit bigger. I guess we, had a little bit more milk when we were kids or something, a little extra around the middle. And yeah, we have not always been heavily involved in agriculture policy specifically, but over the last 10, 15 years, I think have really been, along with Izaak Walton League and the support of all of you who have been involved in the past, been leaders in making sure that conservation is as good as it can be in the political climate that exists. And so I say that to emphasize that is going to be the case for this coming Congress as well. We're going to need you all, and hopefully we can all get some good advancements in the Farm Bill and build off of the Inflation Reduction Act funding that we got in the last year. So thank you.
Yeah, I just see Jill Crafton has a quick question. Jill, do you want to ask? And then we'll be putting questions in the chat box as well. So Jill, do you want to ask a question?
I just wanted to bring something up. So Ding Darling, I think, wanted to be involved with a wildlife organization. And so when he was trying to start that organization, he recruited a whole bunch of Izaak Walton people to be on the board in order to be able to launch it. So I just wanted to let Ben know that.
Yes.
We have a history together.
Yes.
I did not realize that. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's great, Jill, because he was the founder of the National Wildlife Federation too. In 1936, I saw that.
Yeah, and a great Ike. So yeah.
Yeah, and he started the Des Moines chapter here in Iowa.
And you can see,
That's great.
I think some of Ding's original prints at the Des Moines chapter of the Izaak Walton League. So check it out. That's pretty fun.
I gotta brush up on my history. I was a history major in undergrad, so this is like right up my alley.
Well, there's a whole bunch in the book, Born with This Double. So
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that input. And when you come down to the Des Moines Ikes, Ben, we can give you a tour, and we've got a little library there now too.
Great.
Well, speaking of history, this thing that we today call the Farm Bill comes around about every 5 years. The first one was actually a series of 3 pieces of legislation passed in the 1930s. And that was a time where during the Great Depression, you had 20 or 25% unemployment. So we had a lot of people in the country who had no money for food. So we had people starving, a lot of people starving in this country. You had farmers who had customers who couldn't afford to buy food. And so farmers were going broke because they were producing enough food, but nobody had money to pay them for it. So you had record high, you had unemployment, you had starvation in the country, you had farmers who were going broke. And at the same time, this was during the Dust Bowl, a time when you had that great drought in the middle of the country in the Great Plains. Many of those acres had been plowed up to plant wheat or corn or other crops. And so when the winds came up, when the droughts dried out the soil and the winds came up, you had these huge dust storms that blew throughout the Great Plains. And one of those dust storms blew all the way from Oklahoma and Kansas to Washington, D.C. And there was a member of Congress who was quick enough to understand that, no disaster should go unused. And so he called a hearing on soil conservation in Washington in Congress the day that this dark black cloud of soil from Oklahoma and Kansas rolled through and darkened the sky in Washington, D.C. So that very first Farm Bill, those three pieces of legislation really had in them things that are still in the Farm Bill today. They focused on food. So the food stamp program was created back then in the 1930s. It was something called the Agriculture Adjustment Act, which was a way of keeping farmers in business by helping them pay their expenses and helping them stay on the land at a time when people couldn't afford to buy what they were growing, and created the Soil Conservation Service in the 1930s. And that was the federal agency. Today it's called the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And so their activities are a little more broad than they were. They were originally focused on soil conservation, but it was intended to help farmers understand and adopt better conservation practices to conserve the soil that we were losing. And so those three themes still run throughout today's Farm Bill. And if you look at the last Farm Bill, which was passed in 2018, about 3/4 of the funding actually went for those nutrition programs, for what we call the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is the current version of those food stamp programs, and for other nutrition programs. About 3/4 of it goes for that. We still have both subsidized crop insurance and commodity programs, which go to help farmers adjust to bad years, helps them stay in business during years when either their crops fail because of the weather, it's too wet, it's too dry, there's too many insects, whatever it is, and also years when the bottom falls out of crop prices. So that's still a big part of the Farm Bill. And then one piece of the Farm Bill, it's only about 7%, but it's about $5 billion, about $6 billion a year, goes for conservation programs. And those are programs that help farmers and ranchers adopt conservation practices that will be good for wildlife, that will be good for soil conservation, for water quality, for water quantity. So that's how that federal Farm Bill today is still structured, kind of like it was, almost a century ago. And that's kind of what Ben and I are here to talk to you a little bit about. It's a real exciting time to be in ag policy, because 2023 is the year Congress is supposed to write a new Farm Bill. Most of those programs and most of those changes that were enacted in 2018, many of them expire at the end of this year. And so Congress is on the hook to hopefully write a new Farm Bill and hopefully write a better Farm Bill. And that's what we're here to talk to you about.
Fabulous. So Duane and Ben, do you guys want to just talk a little bit about what you've learned with your listening sessions? Both of you have been involved with listening sessions throughout a few states. And what are your primary feedbacks from people you're hearing from? I know you've had farmers in the room, you've had other people as well. Do you want to just share with us what you've learned? And then also, is it too late to have inputs? And do you think it would make a difference?
Yeah, I can start off here, Duane, if you don't mind. And you can please fill in anything I miss. Yeah, so we've held we've held one. We're supposed to have held two at this point. Summits in one in Danville, Illinois, which was focused on Indiana and Illinois, and then one in Mason City, which was going to be more focused on Minnesota, Iowa, and the south western part of Wisconsin. And yeah, it was a pretty wide group of people who joined us. We had some farmers, we had some conservationists, we have a number of environmental groups signed up, and also some folks who are focused on food, because I think, as in this Farm Bill, as opposed to previous ones, there's a lot more focus on kind of holistic resilience, and people are starting to recognize how food security and conservation, so, water health, soil health, water quantity, equality, all of these things play off of each other. And the system as it's set up is pretty good, but really has some deficiencies. And so what we heard a lot from folks in the room was just that. Most of my thoughts are from people, at least as much as I can, people who are actually experiencing the conservation programs and are doing the farming and are living across the country, because I have a I have a more limited view, being just outside of DC. So what we settled on as priorities out of our Indiana and Illinois session was to make sure that the conservation funding in the Inflation Reduction Act stays in conservation, and making sure that it is addressing the urgent climate and conservation needs that exist. And already we're starting to hear some, and I'm sure you all are, if you're pay even half as close attention as I do, folks who are seeing that big pot of almost $20 billion and want it for their little pet projects, for things that do not have public benefits that can benefit themselves. And so what we're trying to do, and I think Duane is with me on this, is trying to make sure that stays in conservation, and that conservation is addressing the most urgent needs facing our agricultural and environmental and wildlife communities.
Yeah, and I think I would note that in a run up to this, so last year, National Wildlife Federation held some regional meetings with NWF state affiliates around the country to get input from their members and their allies. The Izaak Walton League held several listening sessions to hear from, some of them were from young farmers, some of them were from conservation allies and from Izaak Walton League members, mostly here in the middle part of the country where a lot of you are from. And I think a lot of what we heard were several things. One, how important these conservation programs are to life on the ground, conservation on the ground. And if you look at states, in the middle of the country, the Dakotas, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, in most of those states, those federal farm conservation dollars are the biggest pot of money in the state for doing private lands conservation work. And typically it's 100 million to 200 million or 300 million. In Iowa, it's over $400 million a year that flows through, those are federal tax dollars that flow through the state Natural Resource Conservation Service through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And they're used by farmers to adopt those conservation practices. And it's everything from doing better soil health practices to planting buffer strips that are going to protect streams, to doing forest management, to do integrated pest management. So there's a lot of things that can get done with those dollars. So that's one thing we heard, is those dollars are really critical to conservation in those states. Another thing that we heard, and it's been backed up by some recent research, is that those programs, there's huge demand for those programs, and it's growing demand from farmers because they realize how important this conservation work is. And if you look at just the last several years in some of the bigger USDA conservation programs, and we'll try to stay out of alphabet soup for you, but there's a couple of big working lands programs, Conservation Stewardship Program and Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And less than a third of the farmers who apply for help through those programs actually get funded. So they actually get money from USDA to help them put in place those practices. So we know there's huge demand. We know the programs are underfunded. And so those are two things that we heard. And as they're great programs, they're really critical. We heard that they're underfunded, that we need more money to help more farmers put in place more practices. And we also heard a lot of folks talking more about soil health. And that's something we didn't hear 5 or 10 years ago very much of. The science is really coming around, and people are really starting to understand that the healthier your soils are, the more life is in your soil, the more biology is in your soil, the healthier they are, the more those soils can absorb rains when they come instead of having it run off, carry sediment with it. The more that they can support wildlife habitat, the more that they can help in dry times and out in the western part of the country, make the best use of those rainfalls that you do get. And so whether you're talking about, insects and pollinators or putting carbon in the soil to help us with climate change, all of those things benefit from healthy soils. So that's, another thing that we heard, a theme running through what we heard from people, is that soil health is important, and we need more of the money we need more focus on soil health and more money for soil health. And fortunately, we've mentioned it a couple times, but that Inflation Reduction Act, and that was the big mega bill that got passed last August in Congress. And, a big chunk of it was for deficit reduction. A big chunk of it was for other non-conservation things. A big chunk of it was for climate change, for renewable energy, lots of different kinds of investment like that. A little piece of that, and by little we mean $20 billion, so to us it looks pretty big, was to help put more money into these conservation programs. And if you look at the 5-year farm bill, it put about $30 billion over 5 years into these conservation practices and programs. That Inflation Reduction Act put about $20 billion over, I guess, 4 or 5 years. It can be spent over the next 10 years, but added about $20 billion to that total. So you can see what that money does will help meet some of that backlog of unfunded projects, unfunded conservation projects. And part of our challenge, as Ben mentioned, this coming year is to make sure that we protect that money, to make sure it goes what it was intended to go to, which is conservation on farms and ranches.
Yeah, and just to build off that a little bit, Duane, you mentioned how we heard the need. So from our affiliates, we were also hearing that need over the past several years, and we held some other listening sessions for NWF specifically. But the point is that what we were hearing is that there's this massive need. So there was a large campaign over the last couple of years to double up conservation funding, and that didn't happen quite in the IRA funding, as Duane mentioned. We fell a little short of the goal, but what was critical in that, when you looked at what was initially proposed in that bill and what ended up passing in that bill, almost everything got massive, massive, massive cuts. But what did not get massive cuts was the conservation funding. And that is because of the large group of folks and organizations who lent their support to that. So, it wasn't just the national organizations saying that we need more money. It wasn't just think tanks saying we need more money. It wasn't one party or the other party saying we need more money. There's a broad recognition of the need for more conservation funding because of the benefits that it gives not only to water, but soil and communities, and frankly, farmers' bottom lines. So when we're talking about this IRA funding, we are going to be putting out a letter in the next week or so asking for support, and we'll circulate it to all you folks. And it would be great to have your consideration on that, if not support. And so I just wanted to tee that up now. So when it comes, you can see it coming. I'd be happy to answer more questions about that. But the upshot is that this funding is critical, and it's very much needed across the country. And it's actually funny, Christine, I love the title of this, We Are Not a Farm Bill Flyover State.
Yeah.
That is so true. If you want to talk about the states that folks pay attention to in the Farm Bill, it is Iowa, it is Minnesota, it is the Midwest, because of what a powerhouse it is. So, yeah.
That's great. We have a couple of questions in the chat box, and I'll just, I can read them in order. And then Ben or Duane, you could decide who wants to answer them. Carolyn Van Shank is our Minnesota driftless coordinator. She's my colleague for the Upper Mississippi River Initiative. And that was actually her little, she decided on the title for our talk. So you can give her credit that we're not flyover states. What is the overall conservation strategy among groups like the Izaak Walton League and NWF to actually get serious conservation into the agriculture components of the Farm Bill? And what aspects look most promising to you at this point?
So it's a great question. We've touched on a couple of the things that a lot of the conservation groups are rallying around. One is to make sure that that $20 billion gets spent wisely. So we don't want it to just get spent. We want it to get spent on good conservation practices. Climate-friendly conservation is what the money is intended to go for. And so putting in place good farm and ranch practices that we can all be proud of, that we can point to deliver those kinds of conservation and natural resource benefits around the country. So that's one piece of what we're trying to do together. Another piece is to make sure that that money doesn't get diverted for something else. And so defending that funding is a piece of what we're trying to make sure to do. And there's lots of folks who would love to have that conservation dollar for all kinds of other kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And a third piece of it is trying to make sure Congress understands and deals with the need for long-term funding for those programs. This 20 billion was kind of a short-term infusion of money into the system, and it's great, and we're going to make the best use of it we can. But we also got to recognize that, farmer demand for these programs and these program dollars is outstripping the money that's there, and it's going to continue to grow in the future. I think we all recognize that the continued demands that we make on farmers and ranchers to adopt climate-friendly practices, to adopt wildlife-friendly practices, to adopt water-friendly practices, we're asking a lot of them, and we need to be prepared to help farmers make those transitions. And so long-term, we want to build that the long-term funding for these programs into this next farm bill. So I guess that's three things I'd point to that a lot of the conservation groups who are working together at the national level are coming together around.
That's great. Ben, do you have any other inputs?
Well, I would totally agree with Duane on those points. And, it's funny. So, we throw out this number like $20 billion, right? Like that is a huge, huge number, an incomprehensible number for any reasonable person, right? But what Duane led off with in this was pointing out that, and I think the projections in this next farm bill are that, about 80% of the farm bill dollars are going to be going towards things other than, more than 80% are going to be going towards things other than conservation. So while $20 billion is a lot, when you put it in the context of what is being spent, it's not equitable to what everyone else is getting. And so we want our fair piece of the pie is part of the rationale as well. And what is promising, I do think this IRA funding is very promising. I think folks are very invested in keeping it. At the beginning of the call, also, Christine, you mentioned the incorporation of soil health into some of the other pieces of the Farm Bill, like crop insurance. One effort that me and Duane are working on is called the Cover Act. And what that bill does is gives a $5 per acre discount for acres with cover crops planted off of their crop insurance costs. And so it's a relatively low discount compared to, for example, what the Natural Resource Conservation Service pays to put in cover crops with farmers. It's a much lower number. And what it's resulted in is a tripling, more than a tripling of the reported number of cover crop acres. And the reason that's a big deal is because it's all the things that we're talking about today, right? We're talking about soil health, we're talking about water, we're talking about preventing soil and agriculture runoff from going into the rivers. And so the Cover Act is a low investment, high return sort of bill that we think should be incorporated into the next Farm Bill.
That's great. We have a couple more comments or questions. Jill Crafton from Minnesota, she's our colleague in Minnesota, who's been an Izaak Walton League member for a number of years. And she says there are farmers who are having trouble selling their crops or are in need of processing / slaughtering facilities. Is there going to be money to help these farmers as well?
Yeah, and I think if you look at the Farm Bill, a little piece of the Farm Bill are things like marketing programs. One thing that was included in some of the legislation that was passed last year was additional funding for those small meat processing facilities. Those provide a lot of, we have a system where a lot of the slaughterhouse, a lot of where cattle and pigs and stuff get processed are in the hands of a very few really big corporations. So that doesn't give a lot of choice to consumers or to farmers. And so trying to help build out and restore some of that local meat processing, those local plants, which can help, give consumers a place to go and get maybe grass-fed, grass-fed beef or farm-raised, pork and chicken and things. So trying to help those folks build those facilities and increase the size of them. That's one piece of funding that was included in some of that legislation. And that's a program that's included in the Farm Bill. So they'll be talking again about, what do we do with that program, and can we use it to help leverage those things to help small businesses open and expand in rural areas to provide those choices for farmers and choices for consumers who want, the kind of meat that maybe you can't get from a giant packing plant.
Great. There's the next questions, and I might not pronounce this name right. I think it's Lisa McNeil. Does any Farm Bill money subsidize drain tile installation? Should we be supporting no support for drain tile? ?
Yeah, those are both good questions, Lisa. And I guess, your first question about our environmental entities united, I would say not every organization has the same agenda. That, wetland organizations are focused on wetlands and grassland organizations on grassland. And so different groups have different priorities, but I think there is a general recognition and everybody rallies around the need for more funding, the need to spend what we are spending wisely, and the need for more funding to help more farmers do more conservation. So I think there's at least consensus around that part of the agenda. We used to do, so USDA used to do quite a bit of funding the installation of drain tiles around the country. They're doing a lot less of that now. I don't know that they're not doing any of it. So there are still some practices that are on the USDA conservation practice list. I haven't looked at the numbers. Maybe Ben knows how much of that money's going for that.
I can't tell you exactly off the top of my head, but there is some, but it's also not a huge amount. At this point, it's largely, if it's a supporting practice for another more important conservation need than just water, but there is some. I think what that makes me think about is conservation compliance. And so I don't want to get too far into the weeds on Farm Bill stuff, but so conservation compliance in this context is farmers are required to meet minimum standards for highly erodible land and not destroy wetlands to qualify for crop insurance. And so what we've been finding, what the Government Accountability Office has been finding, is that some states where they have found no violations of conservation compliance and things like drain tiles, all their wetlands just happen to be disappearing. And it's very strange that that is happening, given that that is against the law. So one of the things we're going to be pushing for very strongly in this next farm bill is to make sure that people are actually following the rules across the country equally, so that not only are we getting the conservation benefits that everyone has agreed to in signing these contracts, but also so that everybody has an equal playing field who is participating in the market.
Yeah, okay, well, that brings us to our next question is Caroline Van Shank says, given what the House of Representatives looks like at the very moment, is this funding threatened? And also, like, even the Farm Bill with all of these great initiatives that we're putting in, and is it even viable? Does it even look like, because you hear some of the comments about like, oh, we're gonna not, fund any of this, and this is just crazy that it's been like that.
Duane, do you want to take this one? I love this question.
Sure, I'll start, I guess, and jump in. So conservation over the years has been fortunate to be supported on a bipartisan basis. So we have a lot of Republicans, a lot of Republican duck hunters, for example, and pheasant hunters who understand the importance of conservation on the land. A lot of Democrats who understand water quality and climate change. And so conservation funding programs are a place where a lot of them come together. And so we have historically had a lot of support from, both sides of the aisle and from the breadth of members of Congress for those programs. That doesn't mean that the new Congress isn't going to look different than the old Congress, because it is. In the last Congress, Democrats had a small majority in the House. In the new Congress, Republicans have a small majority in the House. But it's really difficult to get everybody in your party on board for everything. And so historically, the farm bills have been bipartisan legislation. And we especially see that because in the Senate, where you've got a Senate that's, 50 to 49 and one extra. So it's very close. And in the Senate, they've always had a very bipartisan structure there. And so you really can't get a farm bill with just one party or the other. And especially this year, you got a Democratic Senate and a Republican House, both of them very tight margins. And so you're going to have bipartisan support for whatever you do in the farm bill. And so that's at least, a very hopeful sign, I think. And I think hopeful for us because conservation is one of the more bipartisan pieces of what's in that farm bill.
Yeah, that was a great answer, Duane. I think to add to the IRA funding threatened? I would say that it is threatened, but it is not threatened by the House of Representatives. It is threatened by non-conservationists, to Duane's point that these things tend to be very bipartisan. So that is why I keep harping on the need for the conservation community to be united in protecting the IRA funding. Now, that being said, I think that it is not, dire straits by any means either. GT Thompson, who is a representative from Pennsylvania, the presumed chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, has committed already to a bipartisan farm bill. And I think members on both sides of the aisle and both chambers, if not all members, are committed to getting a farm bill done. And that would include strong conservation provisions and funding.
Well, that's great to know. Patrick Swanson has a comment in, I guess, a statement. I work in the Lost Hills area, and one of the things I would like to see is stronger prioritization for grassland restoration, e.g. CRP on steep slopes that help link existing conservation lands. I know there is a matrix to make decisions, but I don't know how much of these factors guide decision-making. I also think there should be longer easements permanent for these programs. Also, some of these issues also surround what these CRP lands can be used for, IG grazing, haying, etc.
Yeah, those are great comments. And I think probably Ben and I are both pretty supportive of some of those ideas. We support, there's money in the Farm Bill for restoring wetlands and prairies and putting long-term permanent easements in states where you can do a permanent easement, which is most of them, where you can do permanent easements to protect those wetlands as wetlands and protect those prairies as prairies. So that's pretty important. The Conservation Reserve Program is a great way to take some of those marginal cropland acres and some of the highly erodible, the steep soils, stuff that maybe shouldn't have been plowed in the first place, put it back into grass, and either keep it there for conservation purposes or transition it to a grazing situation where you've got, a well-managed grazing operation there. And so I think those are some of the things that certainly are on our priority list for this coming Farm Bill.
Yeah, agree with that. And just getting just a little bit cognizant of the time, I guess. We are pushing for slightly stricter rules on what can be hayed in particular, because haying is pretty detrimental to some of the environmental benefits that happen. And I just want to make the point that, so the CRP that we're referring to here, Conservation Reserve Program, is a program that comes under attack from some farming specific groups because they call it a land retirement program, which may have been true, almost 40 years ago when the program was first created, but is not really the case now. And so I just encourage you, if you hear folks talk about ending CRP, getting land out of CRP because it's preventing folks from farming, that's really not the case anymore. It's not a perfect program. We want to see improvements, but it's not as though we're just paying farmers not to farm their land. What we're paying landowners to do is to take largely marginal lands out of production and make sure we're getting environmental benefits out of those lands. And there's huge water benefits to CRP. So I just want to make that very clear, which with this audience, that may be obvious already, but it's a very important program.
Well, that's fantastic. I know we have a few more comments, and we have been here for a while, and thank you everybody for staying with us. We still have about close to 40 people still on the call, so I know people are interested. So thanks to both of you again. So Caroline Van Schenk, she doesn't mean to be a chat box hog, she says, but for a really unfortunate development, landowners in Southeast Minnesota are beginning to put in tile drain. Like NRCS folks tell me that compliance is complaint driven.
Yeah, and those are two important comments. I know if you look at that part of southeast Minnesota and northeast Iowa, the driftless area there, you've got a lot of the underlying geology means that when you put in tile drain, sometimes it just goes like pretty much straight into the river.
Like
And
Iowa.
like in Iowa. And, you know, I think there is certainly some room here for a lot more education. If you think about the cost that farmers are paying, and it's sometimes $1,200 or $1,500 an acre to put in pattern tile. That's a huge investment to try to take a little water off your land. If you think about that and you spend $40 or $50 a year planting cover crops and going to no-till and really building that soil health, a lot of those ponding problems disappear because you'll have better water infiltration of those soils. And so, you know, if you think about how many years you could plant, you could spend $50 for cover crops before you got to 1,200. I mean, you know, you got to talk about several decades worth of those conservation practices that in probably several years could deliver similar conservation benefits for that landowner. But that's not the story that's out there. That's not what people are hearing. That's not what banks are hearing. That's certainly not what they're saying. And so people can get loans to install tile drains, you know, huge investments. And we think there's better conservation alternatives to managing some of those, you know, soggy soil problems. And that's, I think, you know, education is something that will help turn that. But, you know, that's something that we continue to struggle with, is how do we get that
The word's
message
out.
out there?
Jill Crafton,
Sorry, Christine, just real quickly, I'm not
Yeah.
going to add too much there, just that NWF actually has a conservation outreach team, our ag team does.
Cool.
So if anyone is interested, I'm happy to connect you with them, and they can maybe, if not point you in the right direction for research, or if not do something more, point you at least in the direction of resources.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's really good to know, Ben. And I will, we will send out the link to the recording, and I will put in any of the references you guys have referred to. So I will make sure, Ben, that we get that in and make that available. Jill Crafton says some Ikes in regions of Minnesota are hearing from farmers who are considering trying regenerative ag practices, but they can't get bank loans locally for these practices. While, you know, while this isn't a farm bill issue, could your organization help with outreach to state leadership to help us with this barrier? That's a good point, right?
Sure, and Ben just mentioned some of the things NWF is doing in terms of outreach to farmers. We have to talk to farmers, and we also have to talk to bankers about these practices and other lending agents. And we need to talk to rural cooperatives who provide advice to farmers. And one of the things the Izaak Walton League is doing that you're, you know, about the first to hear about it. So we're trying to launch a farmland owners network, which is for people who own farmland but don't farm it. So if you inherited your acres from your parents, or you bought it because you want a place to hunt or fish, there's a lot of those. In fact, about half of the cropland in America is not owned by the person who farms it. So there's a lot of rented acres out there. What we're trying to do is help those folks, help those landowners better understand soil health and some of these conservation practices that are available, so they can do a better job of managing and owning, you know, that farmland that they own. And they can talk to their farmers about soil health and conservation practices, and talk to each other about what works and what doesn't, and what struggles they have. So that's, you know, a niche that we're trying to help be part of, is to help educate those farmland owners about these kinds of conservation issues.
Yeah, because we've had many NALO events, and several other organizations have too. I know it's always a big topic that gets brought up. there's a couple of more questions and then I'll let you guys kind of wrap things up. And I do have a couple more quick announcements, but Lisa says, Ben and Duane, do you think conservation organizations will be unified to support of a certain farm bill? And then Caroline builds on that and she says, what's next and what's the order of things to get the 2023 farm bill?
Big questions.
Yeah.
Yes. I think in general, conservation organize will, and I'm not exactly sure what you mean by a certain farm bill, but I do think that there are general sort of priorities being arrived at. Protecting conservation funding, which we've kind of harped on to death here, being one of them. Making sure that money is spent wisely and effectively, making sure that climate change is included, maybe not the focus, but is certainly included and addressed at a greater level than it has been in the past. And making sure that the farm bill is more equitable in reaching small, mid-size, and historically underserved farmers, so that everybody is getting a piece of the pie, and not just the big folks who don't necessarily need the same level of support.
That sounds good. So Chris Henning says, Ben, can you talk a little bit about your Conservation Champions program that you've been involved with? Is it geared to farmers?
It is geared to farmers. It is a little bit more of a train the trainer sort of program. So we and I'm not deeply involved in the Conservation Champions program, so I can't speak in all the specifics, but our team goes out and it trains folks who are interested in doing conservation outreach and who are farmers themselves to then turn and how can they help their neighbors, how can they help folks who are interested in doing conservation practices. And like I mentioned, I'm happy to point you all to that resource after the call on a follow-up email.
Okay, that's fantastic. We do have one more comment or maybe question from Mike Carberry. Are conservation groups partnering with environmental groups and farm groups to build critical mass on our shared priorities regarding the farm bill? Do you see that coming together, both of you?
Sure. I mean, I think that's, so the Izaak Walton League is part of a number of different coalitions or networks. We network a lot with some of the sustainable and organic farming organizations. We network with the kind of hunting and fishing and wildlife groups like, Ducks Unlimited, Trout Unlimited, Pheasants Forever. We network with some of the environmental groups, the green groups, Environmental Working Group and Natural Resources Defense Council and groups like that. And I see Ben and the folks from NWF on a lot of those kinds of network calls. So those organizations at the national level are spending a lot of time talking to each other about our priorities. And so I think, there are very few groups that have an identical platform to other groups, but I think they're coming together around some of the themes that we've talked about tonight. And it isn't just environmental conservation groups. I mean, we work with the National Farmers Union and some of the Farmers Union state organizations, and some of the conservation groups and farm groups at the national level have come together around some priorities that deal with climate smart agriculture. And some of the things they're recommending are some of the things we've talked about tonight. So trying to help crop insurance programs recognize the benefits of soil health practices. We've been focused on a state and tribal grant program to help states do more soil health strategies. Certainly some of the support for more climate-friendly farming is included in some of those. So I guess I'd say, yeah, there's a lot of discussions, a lot of conversations going on, and I think a lot of groups working together of different kinds.
Great. That's
Likewise.
fun. I know it's complicated, and I know we have a big controversy here in Iowa with our carbon pipelines that are claiming to capture carbon, with ethanol plants, and so that's a big controversy here, and and lots of people from all different angles and sides are on board with that controversy. So it gets kind of complicated, and I know there's a lot of funding, so it's tempting to use it for private goods sometimes when it really does need to go to the farmers on the ground, so to speak. So, does anybody else have any questions before we close off this evening? I'm just so grateful that both Ben and Duane have taken time, and we will keep you posted with their activities. And if there's anything that anybody on this call that would like to contribute, please feel free to reach out, and we can get your inputs. It's not too late. So we will make sure. Next month, we have another Thinking Like a Watershed with Maya Van Rosum, and she is the author of the Green Amendment, which is all about pure water, clean air, and healthy environment. And she's actually going to be coming to Iowa in April for some visits for Iowa. And I put the link in the chat box too. That seems reasonable that we could all agree that we should have clean water and clean air, and hopefully the farm bill will continue, and we'll get some good funding that will be transparent and on the ground and make a difference. Everybody.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I want to emphasize that all of you can make a big difference. If you look at the map of who's going to make the decisions about this next farm bill, it's primarily the House Agriculture Committee and the Senate Agriculture Committee. And most of the states that I saw represented tonight, Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, Illinois, you folks have more than one member you have a senator on the Senate Agriculture Committee, and states like Minnesota and Iowa have 2 senators on the Senate Agriculture Committee. Most of you have House members on the House Agriculture Committee, and they really need to hear from you. And it does make a difference when they hear from their voters, when they hear from their constituents, people who are saying, wildlife conservation is really important. Water quality is really important. This next farm bill needs to make sure we're taking care of helping farmers address climate change, address water quality, address wildlife, address soil erosion, soil health. That does make a difference. And so we really, thank you for being involved, and we really appreciate what you can do, because that's who those folks listen to in Congress. They listen to their voters. So that's pretty critical.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening. And we had a pretty good turnout, and they stayed with us most of the time. So thanks again, both Ben and Duane, and Chris Henning, and Carolyn Van Shank, and other people that I see on here that we all know. There's a lot of really great people involved with all kinds of different initiatives and organizations, and from farmers to water quality specialists to concerned citizens, etc. So thank you very much, and have a beautiful evening, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
Thanks,
It was
everybody.
really nice meeting you all. Bye-bye.